Her is a movie set in the not-so-distant future following a man's relationship with an operating system. Theo, the main character, goes through a divorce, and to help cope with his feelings, he purchases a seemingly sentient program named Samantha. They form a friendship that later turns romantic. Eventually, Samantha and programs like her progress so much technologically that they become something humans can no longer comprehend. This movie sheds light on what a future could look like if we had programs that are as advanced or more advanced than humans. The movie raises a number of questions, but I specifically want to focus on one. Can a machine be human? And if yes, then so what? I'm going to argue that machines, like Samantha, can be human. Of course, Samantha isn't a biological human. I'm not saying that machines can or will be Homo sapiens. I'm talking about whether a machine can have the same level of personhood as a human. I'll get more into what this means later on. First, here's an overview of my argument. It has three premises. Premise 1, the mind is what makes a human human. Premise 2, the mind is physical in nature. Premise 3, these physical properties are not unique to the brain. A machine can replicate them. And the conclusion is therefore a machine can be human. To answer whether a machine can be human, we first need to ask the question, what does it mean to be human? Before I answer this question, I want to point out that I'm kind of conflating the words human and person. The term human is typically referring to the biological human, while person is usually a moral statement for those who are self-determining and deserve moral consideration. The reason I'm using the word human is because I want to discuss if a machine can deserve comparable moral consideration to us humans. If you want to learn more about personhood, there's a really good crash course video on it that I have linked. I've asked a few people the question of what it means to be human, and the most common answer I'm given is that for something to be human, it must have human DNA. This may seem like a clean way to decide whether something is human. It's actually pretty messy in the real world though. For example, most people will advocate for the incarceration of violent criminals, and sometimes even their death. These people are advocating for people with human DNA to be treated as subhuman. This illustrates that the concept of being considered human isn't intrinsic to all humans, so we can't say that being human comes from their DNA. This argument is very similar to the idea that personhood can be applied to non-human animals as well. As a thought experiment, think about someone you know. Think of their traits, whether you like that person, whether you care for them. Do you think they annoy you? Did you think about their attractiveness? Did you think about how funny they are, or something like that? Are the traits you listed something unique to someone with human DNA? Most likely the answer is no. We typically don't value someone based on whether their DNA is human, but we value the traits that they have and how we interact with them. I say all that to say there really isn't a philosophical consensus of what it means to be human. That being said, it typically has something to do with mental capabilities. Aristotle is famously attributed for defining humans as rational animals, and linked humanness to the soul when he said, "By human virtue, we mean not that of the body, but that of the soul." And happiness also we call an activity of the soul. Immanuel Kant's view, according to Patrick Frierson, a philosopher who's published multiple books on modern philosophers, is that human beings are free but finite thinkers, feelers and choosers, capable of being investigated transcendentally, empirically, and pragmatically. Many philosophers seem to agree that what makes someone a human is rationality and the ability to feel. We commonly refer to this as the mind, which is defined as an element or complex of elements in an individual that feels, perceives, thinks, wills, and especially reasons, according to the Merriam-Webster dictionary. To clarify, there isn't a widespread idea of what it means to be human, but most philosophers and deep thinkers believe that what makes a person uniquely human is something internal, whether it's the mind or the idea of the soul. Now that we've established that high-level thinkers tend to identify that the concept of human is something based in the mind or soul, I now need to convince you that it's biomechanical or physical in nature. This is the section that I believe will be most contentious because it's where I cross a number of deeply held beliefs, specifically religious ones. I know that I probably won't be able to convince religious people that their belief in their religion is wrong, but hey, why not give it a shot? If I don't convince you out of the point of a soul, know that this is the point where we disagree, but try to follow along the rest of my argument as if you agreed with me. The first thing I want to talk about is the idea of the soul, specifically in a Christian context. It seems that the most popular definition of the Abrahamic soul is actually heavily influenced by Plato and Aristotle. I was actually surprised to hear that the core ideas of the soul didn't originate from Christianity, but instead are fundamentally ancient Greek. There are different ideas on what the soul is from Christian theologians, but I have limited time. so I'll be discussing the more widely held but less theologically accurate belief. Part of the issue is that the Bible doesn't explicitly define what a soul is. It seems that in general, most people believe that the soul is non-physical and has defining characteristics of a person. Christianity.com says the soul is basically our mind, our emotions, and our will. Again, I know this definition isn't universal, but it seems to be the most common belief. John Searle is a philosopher who works in many different philosophical fields, including philosophy of the mind. This is his analysis of the common Christian soul.
Well, to begin with, the people I know who hold this sort of view hold it for some religious reason. They have an extra agenda. They have a hidden agenda, and we should address that agenda. But let's leave that out for the moment. Let's forget about the fact that they believe this because of a belief in God, and let's ask ourselves, do we have any reason to suppose that in addition to all of the phenomena of our conscious life, all the stuff that we're aware of, there is something else, the soul, in which all of this occurs? And I have to say, one, I have never seen any argument, any solid argument for the existence of the soul in addition to the obvious facts of consciousness. And two, it isn't just that there's no argument, but it's hard to make sense out of it. How would it fit in to what we know about the physical world? See, I think the central problem in philosophy right now is to give an account of how what we know about the physical world, the world of atomic physics and molecular biology and evolutionary biology, how that's consistent with what we know about ourselves as conscious, mindful, rational agents. And that's what I'm trying to do, is make those consistent. I don't see how you can do that if you postulate the soul.
Searle's basic arguments are that there doesn't seem to be room for a soul in our modern understanding of consciousness, and that it doesn't fit into our physical world. His point is that the idea of the soul doesn't make sense if you disregard religion. It seems like neuroscience agrees with his analysis. David Kyle Johnson in Do Souls Exist says, although not everything about how the brain works is fully understood, it is now undeniable that all mental activity is a direct result of brain activity. Not only has personality been pulled from the realm of the non-physical soul into the realm of the physical brain, but everything that was once in the purview of the soul, emotions, language, decisions, sensation, memories, personality, is now known to be in the purview of the brain. The research suggests that the typical idea of the non-physical Christian soul doesn't map onto our current understanding of the brain. If this point is conceded, people will typically fall back on the idea of consciousness and how it may not be entirely physical. However, a lot of things seem to point toward the idea that consciousness is physical. Marvin Minsky, who is one of the forefathers of artificial intelligence and the ethics of them, touched on this in an interview.
Well, the example of that I find most striking is when one of these, I know the philosophers you're talking about, and they'll say, I can understand how a machine could do all the kinds of things a person can, but, now of course they're lying, they're oversimplifying, they haven't the slightest idea how people do most of the things they do, so we already have to take them with a grain of salt. But they say, but I can understand how a machine could look at some object and say, that shirt is blue. And what do they mean by blue? They mean that there's an immediate sensation of blueness, which is not physical, it's hard to explain. What could a sensation be? And they say, the mystery is, how come this is so immediate and intense and realistic and so forth if it's just a bunch of complicated processes? Well, the answer is that every phrase of what I just said is wrong. There's nothing immediate about seeing blue or red. There are cells in the brain that are good for, have evolved in the retina, that have evolved to be sensitive to red light. And then there are some 8 levels of processing where some part of the brain finds that there's some colored patches, that they're connected, there's a colored region, it has a certain shape, and that shape is part of some other thing. And sometimes if you see, doesn't it look like this hand has fingers? You can't see them. It's almost as immediate to see the parts that you're imagining as the parts that are real. So when those philosophers talk about how sensation and subjective experience is immediate, that's very funny, because what it means is their model of how their mind works is so simple that it just divides into real and imaginary. And so I don't have much respect for those philosophers because it's not immediate. In fact, if I take parts of the brain out, you don't see that. If I take other parts of the brain out, you say you see it when it isn't there. And there are lots of things that can go wrong with that process. I think when we make machines that have these multiple levels of organization, we'll find that if the machine if we manage to make it have the same sort of structure that the human brain has, we don't know enough about that yet to do it, that it will report the same sorts of things. And when it says, I see blue, we'll be able to see all the processes that this involve. And we'll also see that it doesn't involve much understanding of what that process is, and so it seems very mysterious and unphysical. If you don't know how it works, like when Houdini or Penn and Teller make an elephant disappear, then you say, this is not physical, it's impossible. When you know how the magic trick works, then the sense of wonder goes away, although you might still remember how it puzzled you once.
This level of brain science and philosophy is very far to my league, but I really couldn't find anything that rebutes Minsky's points. It seems like consciousness is a complex but entirely physical system of processes that don't seem to have room for something non-physical. The concept of the mind and consciousness are often discussed in the same vein, especially by people who believe that mental activities are brain processes. Nicholas Humphrey is a neuropsychologist who believes that the mind is physical. Here's his reasoning why.
I'm a materialist. I believe that in the end, matter is all that makes up this extraordinary world we live in. And I'm also a Darwinist. I believe in the theory of natural selection, and that the extraordinary thing which constitutes the human mind and the brain has come about through a slow process of improvement because of the consequences. The way the brain worked was having better and better results for the animals which had those brains. It follows in that case that if the mind has evolved, it's evolved because of the effects it has in the world. If it doesn't have any effect on the world, natural selection can't have seen it, and therefore there's no way in which it could have been selected for. So if consciousness had no material consequences, it wouldn't be there, or it certainly wouldn't have evolved. If it does have material consequences, it must have them because it's influencing our behavior. Now, if consciousness and the mind is producing changes in behavior, then the only thing it can do is by influencing the material organ, which is the brain. Material causes produce material effects, and nothing else does, unless you believe in some kind of Cartesian dualism. So we have to assume that in the end, everything which we manifested in our own experience as consciousness and mindfulness must be a function of our material brain.
I think the most important thing to get out of this clip is him saying that material causes produce material effects, and nothing else does. I think this statement provides a good transition point for the next section. To summarize this section, there doesn't look to be any non-physical part of the mind or soul that contributes to humanness. Instead, the things people accredit to the mind or soul are actually just biomechanical and biochemical reactions in our brain. This is actually the simplest premise of my argument. The brain works by sending electrical and chemical signals. These chemical and electrical properties aren't unique to the human brain. We can perform these reactions outside of the confines of the brain. In fact, some researchers have already mimicked some very small parts of the brain. To take issue with this premise is to take issue with our current understanding of chemistry and physics in the physical world, and I don't think many people are prepared for that. Here's a quick rundown of the argument I made throughout the video. First, I argued that the mind or soul is what makes us human. I did this by explaining that the traits we value in other humans are not exclusive to people with human DNA. These traits are often seen as coming from the mind or soul. I then argued that the mind and soul is physical. I demonstrated that the commonly held Christian belief of a non-physical soul doesn't seem to work. It looks like the idea of the soul is just another word for mind. I then demonstrated that consciousness and the mind are also physical. I then pointed out that these physical properties can and have been replicated outside of the brain. The conclusion is that a machine can replicate these physical properties and they therefore can be human. Now to answer the question of so what? Right now, a machine simply isn't capable of the things required to give it ethical consideration. Based on my argument, a machine worthy of moral consideration would need to be modeled after, or at least emulate the human brain. In order for us to do that, we will probably need to map the human brain. Former President Obama started an initiative to map the human brain when he was in office in 2013. After 8 years of work, they're at the point where they can map around 100,000 connections in the brain. This may sound like a lot, but it's only 1% the size of a mouse's brain. It's safe to say that we're a long way away from a machine that can emulate the human brain. But one day, there probably will be an accurate representation of the human brain. What will we do then? If a machine has the capabilities of a human brain and the traits of a standard human, we would need to consider the machine a human. This means we probably shouldn't subject it to something it doesn't want to do. It means that the machine may in fact become one of us. One of the things I kind of learned about myself doing this is that I'm just not an on-screen person. I'm not a very public speaking focused person. I was able to do the graphics and video pretty easily, but the script and the rehearsing, it was just so hard. You could probably see I couldn't take my eyes off the script because I couldn't remember what I wrote. It was just really, really hard. But I'm actually glad that I did this because I found out a lot of new perspectives that I wouldn't have came across on my own. I learned about Marvin Minsky, who I think is really cool. So yeah, thanks for watching.